previous.
Thanks, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here. The conference in Boston last year was one of the best conferences that I've been to. Just before I get started, I'd just like to mention that if there's a messenger to be shot at the end of this talk, it's yours truly. Don't target any other individuals or organizations. The energy sustainability dilemma, can alternatives to oil bail us out? And what I mean by the energy sustainability dilemma is really our whole energy system. Peak oil and liquids are part of that system, but I think we've got a big problem if we look at the totality of the system and all of our options. So I'd like to define how we arrived at the energy dilemma, history, where have we been, where are we currently at, and where are we going in the future. I've used EIA reference forecasts as the business as usual forecast for the future in most of the slides in this talk. I'm not sure I believe we'll ever get to those scenarios, but for the sake of argument, I've used them. The conveners wanted me to talk specifically about natural gas and coal, and so that's what I'll primarily be addressing. You can't talk about those two fuels without also talking about electricity, some issues in keeping the lights on going forward, and why I agree with Matt Simmons, why the energy sustainability dilemma will likely trump climate change in terms of short and medium-term socioeconomic impact. The dilemma could hit us very seriously over the next 10 to 20 years, where climate change is much further out, in my view. If we look at the past 4 decades of consumption, we can see huge growth in consumption of energy in the world, nearly triple since 1965. Oil, of course, the number one source of energy, followed by coal, and then natural gas. If we look at the EIA forecast for the future, the reference case forecast is for 50% growth going forward to 2030. If we look at the reference case forecast by fuel, coal is forecast to be the fastest growing fuel source through 2030, followed by natural gas, hydro and true renewables, nuclear, and oil. If we look at it by economic development, we can see that the developing world, the non-OECD countries, are forecast to nearly double their energy consumption. And they account for about 82% of the world's population at present. So by 2030, the industrialized world will be consuming less energy than the developing world. If you remember 2 slides from this presentation, I'd like it to be this one and the next one. If we look at the longer-term history of growth and consumption of energy in the world, and this is the average citizen of the world, per capita consumption by fuel. We can see in 1850, energy was provided 90% by wood, 10% by coal. It turns out that the average citizen of the world is consuming the same amount of renewable energy today as he was in 1850, if you consider wood and hydro renewable. It also turns out that 89% of the consumption of the average citizen today is coal, oil, gas, and uranium, all of which are non-renewable. And so this is a dilemma. There's 5 times as many people in the world as in 1850. Each person is consuming 8 times as much energy. So the world is consuming 43 times as much energy as it did in 1850. 89% of that energy is provided by non-renewable fuels, all of which likely have a peak sometime in the 21st century. Cumulative consumption of oil by the human race, we got started in 1859. It took us a while to get going. By year-end 2006, we consumed nearly 1.1 trillion barrels of oil, and that's getting close to half of all the oil that humans will ever consume, depending on whose resource numbers you use. The key thing about this is 90% of that oil was consumed since 1958, half of it since 1984, 10% since 2002. We got started on natural gas a little bit later, 1885. We've consumed about half as much energy in terms of natural gas as in oil. 90% of that has been consumed since 1963, half of it since 1988, 10% since 2003. Forecast for natural gas, reference case, 65% growth through 2030. We heard earlier today that there's lots of natural gas in the world. The unfortunate part of that is it's not in North America, and a good bulk of it, roughly 3/4, is in the Middle East and the former Soviet Union. Accessing that gas may be problematic. World natural gas reserve to production ratio at current production rates, North America about 10 years, Europe 20, the world as a whole about 60 years of remaining gas. Campbell's forecast of peak gas, the peak is forecast to be much further out than oil. Combined peak of non-conventional and conventional gas in 2045. But if we convert gas to its energy equivalent, it really won't offset the declines in lost energy from liquids declines. According to Campbell, he's forecasting a combined oil and gas peak in 2010. North American gas production and movements. Canada used to have a program called the National Energy Program, which required us to have 25 years of gas before we could export. That ended in the mid-'80s, and we began exporting as much gas as possible to the US. Our production plateaued in 2002. We exported 48% of our production to the US in 2006. So Canada is the single biggest component of US imports. Reserve to production ratio in North America, Canada, 9 years. The US, about 11, appears to be rising only because production is falling. Mexico, 9, North America as a whole, about 10 years of remaining gas. Canada's exploration treadmill, this is called the law of diminishing returns. If we look at 1996, we completed 4,000 successful gas wells. In 2006, we completed nearly 16,000 successful gas wells. So we quadrupled the number of wells. We got a 10% growth in production until we plateaued in 2002. And we only replaced our production in 3 years out of the last 10. This is what marketable gas production looks like in Canada. This is by month, but it's a smooth moving average. And you can see the peak plateau in 2001, 2002. We're falling off of that plateau as we speak. And this is the reason for the exploration treadmill. The initial productivity of the average Alberta gas well was about 600 MCF a day. In 1996, it is now about 170 MCF a day. So we need to drill 4 wells to replace one 1996 average well. And this is another expression of the same thing, basically. The amount of gas that we added per foot drilled in the Western Canada Sedimentary Basin has declined by half since 1999. Meanwhile, the cost of drilling a foot in the WCSB has doubled since 1999. This has resulted in greatly accelerated finding and development cost. We need $8 gas to make a 10% rate of return in the Western Canada Sedimentary Basin. And as a result, a lot of companies are backing off projects like shallow gas and coal bed methane. This is the expression of that. This is the gas rig count on the left in Canada. Basically peaked in February 2006. It's down about 30% or more from peak. Even with the smooth moving average on the right-hand side, we can see the beginnings of the decline in Canadian gas production. This is a report, a forecast for Canadian gas production published by the National Energy Board within the last 2 weeks. Their reference case is a 12% drop in Canadian production by 2009, so roughly about 4% per year. Their high case is 5% per year going forward. Meanwhile, domestic consumption of gas in Canada is rising. And so you can begin to see the intersection of our own demand and our own production, similar to what we heard in the last talk on the end of exports in oil. Why is the price of gas at the levels that it is, which is high by historical standards, but low compared to some of the recent volatility? And if you look at the US, for example, we can see that gas consumption declined in every sector except for electricity. Peak recent consumption in the US occurred in 2000. Particularly strong demand reduction was in the industrial sector, things like petrochemicals and fertilizers, which have moved offshore to cheaper sources of gas. The EIA's demand supply forecast for the US, Alaska Pipeline coming on in 2017, huge growth in LNG imports. The EIA recognizes Canada's inability to grow exports to the US, but they're also pretty optimistic about growth in lower 48 gas production. In this scenario, they're suggesting lower 48 gas production could grow by 10% through 2017. How realistic is that? If you look at the data, the US is on the same gas exploration treadmill that Canada's on. 1999, 11,000 successful gas wells. 2001, when US gas production peaked, a little over 20,000 gas wells. 32,000 gas wells were drilled last year. And to get to the EIA forecast in 2017, I'm not sure how many wells one would have to drill to get there, and if there's any capacity to be able to do that. Dry gas production in the US grew by about 1.1% per year up until peak in mid-2001. It has declined at about 1% per year since then. Katrina took a lot of gas production offline. Most of that gas production is back, but US production is still at the lowest level since October 1995. And that's not for lack of trying. We're pretty much at an all-time record rig count, a recent record rig count. You can see that when gas production peaked, we had a little over 1,000 rigs working in the US. We now have 1,400 rigs working to essentially keep gas production on a plateau. The best case scenario going forward may be to maintain lower 48 production at about a 1.5% decline per year. If we do that, it implies a very large shortfall in terms of domestic production compared to forecast demand, something in the order of 10 to 11 TCF if that demand forecast isn't lowered. That would have to be brought in by LNG likely. If we look around the world, LNG producers and consumers, we can see that Southeast Asia, Japan, South Korea, and Europe, Spain, Italy, the UK, Portugal, and so forth are all strong LNG consumers. China is an inspiring LNG consumption grower, as is many other countries. The US is relatively small, number 4 in terms of LNG imports. This is a recent map published by FERC showing the proposed LNG regasification terminals in North America. A lot of those are in the Atlantic Basin. How many of those will actually get built? If you look at FERC's website, possibly 11 out of the 44 listed here. So we may have an additional 15 BCF a day of LNG regasification capacity in North America, mainly on the East Coast. I keep a running tally of canceled LNG terminals. I have to keep using smaller and smaller font in this box just to get them all in, but there's 26 canceled in the last 4 years, primarily for NIMBY. People just don't like those terminals located next door. There's been basically one new LNG regasification terminal built in the Gulf of Mexico in the last 25 years, the Accelerate terminal that came online in 2005, and there's been significant expansions in some of the others. And I've just looked at where we're importing the LNG from and how much surplus capacity is available just with the existing LNG terminals. For example, the terminals, if you believe their boilerplate capacity, had about 60 or 70% surplus capacity in 2006. So just because you build 11 new regasification terminals doesn't mean there'll be a supply of LNG to fill them. And the liquefaction end of LNG is really the weak link in the chain at this point in time. Coal. People think of coal as a fuel of the 19th century. In fact, it was the fuel of the 20th century. We got started on coal much earlier than oil or gas, and we've consumed more energy equivalent in coal than we have in oil or natural gas. 90% of that coal was consumed since 1909, 50% since 1970, 10% since 2000. And coal is now the fastest growing fuel source in the world. It grew by about 30% since 2001. Production and consumption of coal in the world. Asia Pacific, a huge producer and consumer of coal, as is North America. And a huge amount of the growth in coal production and consumption occurred in the Asia Pacific region. Forecast of coal consumption in the future, medium estimate 74% going forward. As I mentioned, fastest growing fuel source through 2030 according to the EIA. If we convert hydrocarbons to their energy equivalent, we can see that coal is about 60% of what's left, with gas and oil comprising the remainder. And if we look at the distribution of hydrocarbon energy by region, we can see that the Asia Pacific region and North America really have most of their hydrocarbon energy that's remaining in the form of coal. If we look at hydrocarbon pricing in terms of heat, gas is about half the heat cost of oil at current prices. We can put coal on a ship and move it anywhere in the world for about half the heat cost of gas and a quarter the heat cost of oil. Some of the mine mouth coal-fired power plants in Alberta, for example, where I come from, are among the cheapest fuel costs on the planet. If we look at North American coal production, both in terms of energy equivalent and in terms of actual tons, we can see that in terms of energy, we had a recent peak in production in 1998. The U.S. remains a net exporter of coal, although the U.S. is importing about 30 million tons a year from Colombia into the Gulf of Mexico. On a tonnage basis, coal production is still rising. And the reason for the peak in heat content is because more and more coal is coming from the Powder River Basin of Wyoming, subbituminous coal, compared to the high heat content coals of the Appalachians, which are declining. There's been several interesting studies on coal published since January. This is one by the Energy Watch Group. And they're suggesting that although conventional wisdom would have it that there's hundreds of years of coal supply in the world, Energy Watch Group looked at those estimates, decided the data they were based on was highly suspect, and in fact, there's not nearly as much coal in the world as was previously thought. And the world could experience a peak coal production as early as 2025. Another very interesting study out of Caltech by Dave Rutledge, and Dave Rutledge will be here tomorrow night in a session after dinner. And he looked at the recoverable fossil fuels remaining in the world, and he suggested that, again, that coal was vastly overstated in terms of remaining recoverable coal. He felt there was about 1.6 trillion barrels oil equivalent of remaining coal. To put that in perspective, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change estimated there was 16 trillion tons of recoverable coal, so an order of magnitude higher. Rutledge suggested there was 3 trillion barrels oil equivalent of recoverable remaining oil and gas. The IPCC suggested there was 10 to 15. Rutledge looked at a couple of scenarios. One of them was burn it as fast as we can produce it. Just get rid of it as fast as possible. How much carbon does that put in the atmosphere? He couldn't even get to the lowest scenario of the IPCC because of the limits to recoverable hydrocarbons. Rutledge looked at two scenarios in this case, producer limited carbon, burn it as fast as you can get it out of the ground, and a Kyoto constrained carbon. You still burn it all, but you burn it at a slower rate so it lasts longer. In the production limited carbon, or the producer limited carbon scenario, total peak carbon happens around 2030, and by 2100 we're down to about 12% of the carbon we're emitting today. And that, I can assure you, would be a civilization-defining event if we collapsed that fast. In terms of the CO2 that would put in the atmosphere, in both of these scenarios, he suggested less than 450 ppm, which is Jim Hansen's danger threshold for CO2. So what this indicates to me is not burning all of the hydrocarbons and trying to mitigate consumption of hydrocarbons as soon as possible is really the biggest elephant in the room. There's two elephants for sure, climate change and the energy sustainability dilemma. But I think, like Matt Simmons, that the elephant that's going to be sitting on our chest first is the energy sustainability dilemma. Electricity. If we look at the forecast for total generation in the world, nearly a doubling going forward to 2030. China, triple. India, nearly triple. The rest of the developing world, more than double. And the industrialized world will grow at a much slower rate. Generation by fuel in the world, coal, double. Coal, in fact, will increase market share going forward in this scenario. Natural gas will also increase. Oil will decrease. Nuclear will gain in real terms, but in fact will lose market share going forward. And to grow nuclear by 38% implies a massive construction boom with nuclear. Many of our nuclear reactors are old. There hasn't been a new one started in the US since 1979, 3 Mile Island. They have about a 40-year life. A lot of the nuclear capacity has to be either decommissioned or repowered somehow. So even to keep nuclear growing at 38%, as I said, implies a huge construction boom in nuclear. But it will lose market share going forward. Hydro and true renewables in this scenario will actually lose market share going forward, but will increase in real terms. US generation by fuel, huge growth in the use of coal for electricity generation. This forecast suggests 57% of US generation will come from coal in 2030. They recognize the limitations on natural gas, and natural gas will lose market share going forward. Nuclear will grow slightly but lose market share. And hydro and true renewables, sadly, will only maintain market share going forward. North American generating capacity expansion by fuel. Why is natural gas consumption for electricity growing so much? Well, that's because a huge amount of new capacity was brought online since 1998. 90% of it was gas. Going forward to 2015, there'll be more capacity built. Still some gas, a lot more coal, wind, nuclear, and some hydro. Coal is resurgent in US electric power generation. This is a 2005 map from the American Coal Council, suggesting 124 new coal plants, 75 gigawatts of new capacity by 2020 in the US. What about clean coal? Some people think that's an oxymoron. How clean is clean coal? Clean coal really is higher efficiency generation, which can reduce CO2 emissions by about 25%, with very good cleanup, better than 99% in things like particulates and SOx, and 90% in NOx and mercury. The most efficient current technology is ultra-supercritical combustion. At about 43.5% thermal efficiency, that compares to 34% for a 60s-era coal plant. Denmark, as it turns out, is not only a world leader in wind, it's a world leader in burning coal. Denmark has 7 ultra-supercritical coal plants. All of these plants are located in industrial sectors, so all of the waste heat from the coal plants can be used in industrial processes. And if you can capture and use the waste heat, the overall combined efficiency of those plants exceeds 60% or even 70%, which is much better than combined cycle gas in a standalone configuration. If we burn coal, obviously we must do it utilizing the best technologies to minimize emissions, coupled in my mind with very aggressive conservation and efficiency programs. What about nuclear? I mentioned just to keep nuclear flat will imply a massive construction boom. We're completing 2 to 3 reactors worldwide per year at present. If we keep doing that, the trajectory in installed nuclear capacity will follow the red line. It'll be down about 50% by 2025. In order to keep nuclear flat, we need to build 283 new 1 gigawatt reactors to replace the retirements. To grow nuclear substantially, to meet the World Energy Outlook Advanced Policy Scenario, for example, we need to build more nuclear reactors than are currently present on the planet. So no matter what we do, massive construction boom with nuclear. Vince earlier today mentioned the fuel issue with nuclear. And in fact, we do have a shortfall of about 35% from available uranium mines in the world, which is being made up from reprocessed weapons and other stockpiles, which is projected to run out probably by the end of the next decade. Another study on nuclear, there's about 4.7 million tons of discovered uranium in the world, another 10.1 million tons of undiscovered. If we keep using light water once-through reactors, we'll have an issue with discovered uranium by 2030, and we'll have gone through the undiscovered uranium by a little after 2060. The solution to nuclear is really fast breeder reactors, unlikely before 2030, but fast breeders basically utilize a lot more of the energy in the uranium and minimize the waste issue. Back to the energy sustainability dilemma briefly. There's a great inequity in energy consumption worldwide. I hate to say it, but Canada's at the top of the per capita food chain when it comes to consuming energy, followed closely by the US. Canada's about 5 times the per capita consumption in the world, 9 times China, 30 times India, 100 times Bangladesh. And these kind of glaring inequities in consumption really fuel geopolitical tensions in the world, and they can eventually lead, if we have constrained resources, to the resource wars that Michael Clare talks about and that Matt Simmons alluded to at lunchtime. If we look at per capita consumption, history and forecast, the industrialized world versus the developing world, China, India, and the rest of developing Asia versus the US, Canada, and Europe. We can see, first of all, that Europe is much more efficient than North America. But if China, as forecast, doubles its per capita consumption by 2030, it will still only be about a quarter the per capita consumption of the US and a fifth the per capita consumption of Canada. If that actually happened, this is what total energy consumption would look like. China today consumes about as much energy as the US did in 1965. If it doubles its per capita consumption, China will be consuming more energy than the US will be in 2030. India will double its energy consumption. The rest of developing Asia will also double its energy consumption if there's enough energy on the planet to allow that to happen. Projected peaking of world population, the UN and the US Bureau of Census are suggesting a plateau somewhere above 9 billion people by 2050. We're at about 6.7 billion people today. As we move toward that plateau, the percentage increase in people declines. The number of net people added to the planet declines. If you put motor vehicles on the same vertical axis, and Matt alluded to this again at lunchtime, there's about 800 million motor vehicles in the planet right now, 240 million in the US, only 34 million in China as of 2006. China's increasing at about 20% per year, so 16,000 new motor vehicles per day on the streets of China. Motor vehicles are now increasing in percentage terms far faster than people. In 2005, 70 million new motor vehicles were built, which almost equaled the number of net people added to the planet. How do we feed those people? This is a very interesting diagram. It's actually out of a 1974 Science magazine. Different strategies for getting food, and what's the energy return on investment for the different strategies. For example, hunter-gathering is a very efficient strategy, but you can't have 6.7 billion people on the planet if that's the strategy we use. Coastal fishing, about 1-to-1. Distant fishing, sending fish boats from Portugal to the Grand Banks, about 15-to-1, 15 units in versus every food unit out. Feedlot beef, the same thing. A lot of this energy is hydrocarbons for diesel fuel, natural gas-based fertilizers, antibiotics, pesticides, and so forth. So we've become very dependent on hydrocarbons, not just for transportation, for food, plastics, fertilizers, and so many more things. So in summary, the five-fold expansion of global population since 1850 has been made possible by non-renewable fuels, the consumption of which pervades all aspects of society: food, transport, communication, etc. The eightfold expansion of global per capita energy consumption since 1850 has been entirely a result of consumption of non-renewable energy. Despite the hype, renewable energy technologies are extremely unlikely to be able to replace non-renewable energy in existing demand forecasts. A sustainable future lies in radically reducing and rethinking energy consumption. We have to bring those demand forecasts down to something that makes sense going forward. Natural gas is, unfortunately, as with oil and coal, an irreplaceable one-time resource. North America is on an exploration treadmill with respect to conventional gas, and new supplies from unconventional sources are only serving to slow the rates of decline. LNG will help offset these declines, but North America will be in competition with other countries who also see LNG as a solution. Research on new sources, such as tight gas, shale gas, gas hydrates, must continue, but it would be a huge mistake to assume these sources will be there as an excuse to perpetuate business as usual, based on what we know so far. Coal represents the most abundant remaining hydrocarbon resource in North America and is forecast to be the largest source of generation by far in the world and in the US through 2030, but must utilize the latest technologies, preferably with heat capture and utilization. Even maintaining nuclear's contribution to the world's electricity generation mix implies a major program of repowering, decommissioning, and replacing the aging nuclear fleet. The US and later Canada will become increasingly more vulnerable to the vagaries of imported supplies, not just for oil and natural gas, but for the products produced from them: petrochemicals, fertilizers, plastics, and so forth. There are some crucial decisions to be made with respect to the future energy security of North America and the world. The future represents a huge challenge, and these decisions must be made objectively without ruling out any incremental contribution, both to demand reduction or supply. We'll likely need them all. Thank you very much.